Daniel's here. Correctivity for homeostasis, and thereby autonomy and sovereignty for European peoples, genus and species. I don't know why the sound wasn't working in the last attempt, but it should be okay now. It's reading, so we should have sound. Okay. We do have important matters to apply correctivity to today. Some not so important, but funny matters. Markedly, Richard Spencer in his stream in his Depeche Mode thing, his favorite band. What's supposed to be funny, which is some remarks by Snoop Dogg in regard to Amber Heard and Natasha, what's her name? Ligero. And then from there, we'll move on to more serious matters. That is the another horrendous discussion by, I want to call him Ed Dutton, with Gavin McGinnis, who Jim Google's Gavin, my man Gavin, and Mirth Baron pointed that out to me, and it is indeed horrendous. That will segue well into correctivity applied to 99 Iron Duke, who is a fan of Paul Gottfried, and he's a retired British naval man who lives in Australia, and he streams, identifies as right wing, and agrees with Paul Gottfried, or thinks Paul Gottfried's really good. And one of the good things about discussing him and his what needs to be corrected about his perspective, and it does need it, is that a commentator in his thread, Stephen St. James tends to come here so he can hopefully share the feedback. I doubt that Iron Duke's going to change at his age. He's a little bit younger than me, 57, but he should. And then we're going to talk about how further applications, practical and necessary, of hermeneutics in the last part of the show. All pretty important stuff. Okay. I had some listeners with the original stream. Maybe that they don't realize that I've come back. I had to go off in order to get my sound back. Okay. Anyway, I wanted to start off with this recording, since Amber Heard and Johnny Depp are in the big or the popular news item of the day. And it's not altogether irrelevant, of course. Gender relations in this disorder of late modernity are very much relevant to our situation. Not as central an issue as our ethnic genetic interests, but of course an issue. And I of course didn't know about this because I'm not following popular stuff, but there was one of these roasts that it's on one of the popular networks. I don't know, but Johnny Depp was in the audience, and Amber Heard was being roasted. That's the way of saying made fun of by other people on stage. And she received a question from Snoop Dogg. I don't know if you know who Snoop Dogg is, but he's this like seedy black rapper who's very famous and popular. Anyway, here's what he says to Amber Heard.
Play on stage with me until tonight. It's time to talk about the bitch of the hour. Now, this little bitty fine little. What I want to know is, have you ever sucked a black before? That's a fishing joke. I fish, motherfuckers. Never let a real player on stage.
Okay, now what you can't hear in the audio there is that Amber Heard clearly mouths the response, "Yes, I have," with a big smile on her face. And worse than that, the whole audience, including Johnny Depp, are smiling, and there's Denzel Washington clapping, and everybody like thinks this is so wonderful. My God, Johnny Depp, if you were with any sort of serious awareness, that would have been the end of Amber Heard right there, just to say the least. And the fact that this society would allow that, a piece of shit like Snoop Dogg to say that, to ask that question, or it's mind blowing that European people just put up with this, and it's not the first time. I never would have thought that it would be repeated, but it's not the first time. He did the same thing Snoop Dogg did the same thing at a Justin Bieber roast with Natasha Leggero, who's let me read a bit of her wiki. At least she doesn't answer yes, but Natasha Leggero was born on March 26, 1974 in Rockford, Illinois, and is of Italian and Swedish descent. Leggero was raised Roman Catholic but converted to Judaism as an adult. How weirdo is she? She looks all right, but here's Snoop Dogg talking to her.
Now, this little bitty fine little Natasha Leggett. Is that how you say it, Leggett? Leggetta. That's how we say it. I seen how you was looking at me though, right? What I want to know is, have you ever sucked a black before? Hey, I'm going off script right now. I just really want to know.
And they're all laughing, you know, all laughing that this fucking Martha Stewart is there. And Justin Bieber's laughing, and everybody's like, oh, it's so funny. Martha Stewart's there, and she teams up after this with Snoop Dogg for some sort of, I don't know what, showbiz comedy routine. Martha Stewart, I don't know if people know this, but she is like, you know, this home maker cooking kind of like show lady, and she used to be quite pretty. She's Polish, of Polish extraction, that is, and she was born and grew up in the city right next to mine in New Jersey, Nutley, New Jersey. It's an all white town, but you know, what a scumbag that she's laughing and clapping and thinks this is great. You know, serious need of awareness about this cockery. I mean, Johnny Depp sitting in the crowd and watching as Snoop Dogg asks that question to Amber Heard. And she says, yes, I have, very proudly. I mean, John Depp, you would put up with that? It's no wonder that you got into so much trouble. Some of us men didn't develop strong boundaries because we were trying to sort of cope with the reality of modern women, because we didn't have sisters and mothers who modeled what a normal good woman should be like. Anyway, so you try to overcome that, and like I said, it doesn't work. Anyway, so that's that. That's the first thing I wanted to address. Snoop Dogg, the hell out of my country. At least Natasha Allegro didn't say yes, but Amber Heard did. And that makes me all the more hope that she loses this case. Okay. So on a somewhat lighter note, unintentionally funny would be Richard Spencer. It's hard to take him seriously. I certainly don't. Tom White suggested that I was jealous, and Tom White says that he wants to give money to Richard Spencer, and then he says that I should take a backseat to him and his Nazi friends. How about no? But let me say, it's hard to get to the right timestamp on this player, but I'll try. Because there's just a few seconds, and I don't want your Richard Spencer talking about this stuff for minutes on end. It really is hard to get to the right spot. He did a show on
the different. Anyway, as you can tell, this is an homage to my favorite band, Depeche Mode. And it has been often requested that I do a Depeche Mode space where we just talk about this. Now we can go into other subjects, and of course we will, but I do want to talk about Depeche Mode and everything around it. And also, if you are a fan or you like similar music and you want to testify, you are more than welcome to do that. I see that some people are already requesting a type of sound that I think is genius. Alan Wilder, again, was a very good musician, and I think before I started to develop my own taste. And obviously I had heard kids' music. I loved music that I hear at the movies. I certainly had been exposed to classical music, as we call it, and I'd been exposed to a lot of rock and roll, what you heard on the radio, and also some of the 60s stuff that my parents would listen to. But Depeche Mode was just something totally new, and it was in a minor key. Most all of their songs are in a minor mode. That means it kind of inherently dark, a lot of flat sevens in the minor. This means nothing to you, don't worry about it. I think even if you don't know the basics of music theory, you kind of hear a certain darkness. There's a tough quality to Dave Gahan as a singer. He was a baritone, and he would often kind of bark. He'd sometimes croon, but there was just a certain toughness to it all.
That's what I wanted you to hear. Now, I like Depeche Mode. They're not my favorite group ever, but they have many songs or several songs that I think are great. But would anybody, except for someone who was completely tone deaf, like Richard Spencer, he's tone deaf in more ways than one, say that Depeche Mode has a tough sound? I mean, they have this prissy, effeminate sound that you'll give them credit for just being themselves, for admitting that they're not tough. But for some reason Richard Spencer can't hear that, and he can't. And furthermore, just as he speaks in this effeminate manner, it goes to show how somehow he's blind to the fact that it's not a good look to, promote this kind of sissy-ish band to angry young men, many of whom really are tough, not like Richard Spencer, and so not like Depeche Mode. Anyway, I wanted to point out this funny comment in that regard that the late Kathy Shadle made. Now, Kathy Shadle is coming out of, she's not Jewish, but she, like all those who were in the Ezra Levant school, was a kind of defender of the tribe, and was taking the position that WN shouldn't blame the kosher folks. But that's besides the point. She had she was an intelligent lady and had some and wrote well and said some, of course, good things otherwise, such as this. Where is it? She's shortly after the Hailgate thing of Richard Spencer. She said, "In one short stretch, Spencer has been sucker punched, not a great look. Sucker punched himself at his own conference, declaiming, 'Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory,' with all the quavering conviction of a one-time extra from They Saved Hitler's Brain. Pro tip: as a vehicle for conveying sincerity, volume Malone is a rickshaw at best." And now this multi-level mortification. Spencer was ostensibly expelled from CPAC last week for heading the right-wing fascist group, or the online, and asked if he could stay, if he would simply stay out of trouble. And then he said something even weirder. One reporter asked if he liked rock music, and Spencer replied cryptically, Depeche Mode, or the official band of the alt-right. And Kathy Shadle goes on to mock him as, it's if you wanted to be a bit surprising and off the beaten path, you would choose someone a little more funny for its inappropriateness. It wasn't quite off enough, or someone more accurate. I don't know, the Allman Brothers, or I don't know, what's the other group with Sweet Home Alabama, Leonard Skinner, something like this. But he says that he makes this kind of pansy-ish group, Depeche Mode, into the into the official group of the alt-right. Why did the alt-right fail with Richard Spencer at the helm? Again, that's not to really. I must say I do like Depeche Mode. They're not my favorite group like Richard Spencer, but I highly recommend, for example, the version of Never Let Me Down. It's got a special mix. It's the version that I will tend to play it to post on my Twitter stream. And condolences to the member who died just the other day. Okay, then. So that's what I wanted to say about that. And with Kathy Shadle, another deceased person there, having been a member of Ezra Levant's entourage, that provides a good segue into the next thing that I want to criticize, and not with great elaboration, because really there's too much to it. Ed Dutton, just, I'm liking him less and less. In this case, he interviewed Gavin McGinnis. Of course I never liked him. I'm a normal human being who cares about our people. How could I like Gavin McGinnis? You'd have to be as, misguided as Jim Goad in order to think that Gavin McGinnis is worth 10 cents. Gavin! So Gavin was on the Ed Dolton show, and he was saying that he's coming from the very kosher Ezra Levant school, the same thing as what's her name? What's that blonde woman's name? Lauren Southern, yeah. And a few other misdirecting alt-lighters. And Gavin McGinnis was saying, okay, but you've got to we've got to put aside this idea of, asking who's the whole R question, and who might be mixing with who, and really focus on the class issue, and furthermore, we couldn't possibly direct any criticism of the kosher folks just because of their ethnic genetic interests. It's only a class issue. Yeah, there are a few up there, but by and large, we shouldn't be doing that. Of course, it's going to say that, and of course, Dolton, stupid right winger that he is going to go along with this. He even went so far, as Mirthbaum pointed out, to suggest that the true test of a racist is if they will have a certain number of non-whites at their wedding party. But I'm not going to go into it. It's just that and he talks about how the Proud Boys. It's a pretty gay sounding name, isn't it? Gavin McInnes originally organized Vice News, and he said he was the stalwart against political correctness and quote wokeness. Well, hardly. There's nobody more woke and politically correct than Gavin is on that podcast with Dolton, and that it just got worse when he left. It all went to pot when Gavin left Vice News, which apparently made lots of money. Of course it would, because anytime if you're prepared to toe the kosher line and you have some skills, you might have an inroad. From there, he went on to form the Proud Boys, which are it's just a sickening idea of a boys' club, and it's not. Of course, it's got all kinds in it. It's not exclusively European, of course, and they're just really false opposition to run interference for the kosher right-wing agenda, fighting the Antifa, as I said, who now will be reacting against kosher interests as they've achieved their hegemony following 2008. And they hope to co-opt white right-wingers into that effort, of course, against the, quote, left. I don't need to elaborate further. If you have any sense and you need to puke, listen to Ed Dutton talking to Gavin McInnes, or who Jim Goad would call my man Gavin. Okay. So that segues nicely into some remarks about a guy going by the handle 99 Iron Duke. And he's got some subscribers and listeners, more than I do. He's a retired British naval officer, I guess, living in Australia. And he, on his panel, the kosher question came up. And this is not the first time he's made his opinion on this matter clear, but it's just the latest and probably more clear statement of his position, which is that he insists that the kosher folks are not a big problem, or not a big causality in the problems of European peoples. And he insists, especially not in England. Maybe he'll concede, maybe in America more so. And he even cites as an example of one of the, quote, good ones, Paul Gottfried. He's done this time and again, saying how he likes Paul Gottfried, right? Oh. So, I doubt, I'm not saying this, I'm not rendering this the criticism that I'm going to make with the hope that I'm going to change this guy, this 57-year-old guy's opinion. You know, he'll probably just double down. But what people might learn from his mistake is how this platform that we have here operates by contrast. He's going to try to say that, you know, it's only these Nazi types who would put so much emphasis and culpability on kosher power and influence. He said, I see all these, you know, these English people are doing this harm. What he's not understanding, first of all, is that from this platform, anyway, we're not saying that people of our genetic stock are not complicit, traitors, indifferent. We're calling them right-wingers and liberals and neoliberals and explaining how it is that underpins their betrayal of our interests. Without going into that again, we're neither Nazis nor naive. As to say that kosher power and influence is not coming from us, that these are a different people, an alien people with different interests. And their interests express themselves not only top down in rule structures, but also bottom up from their biological patterns in conflict with ours, typically indifferent, or frequently indifferent, if not outright antagonistic to our homeostasis, to our maintenance of our species. Now, Iron Duke might want to say, well, you know, how is it that they are? I mean, I saw all these European people in England who are betraying our interests, Tony Blair and so on. We don't deny, this platform doesn't deny any of that. It's a crucial aspect that we don't deny it as right wingers would, and who focus only on the kosher question. But Iron Duke, when you consider these 7 to 10 niches of power and influence, and the clear overrepresentation, including in Great Britain, overrepresentation, if not hegemony. That's how it is. They don't have to be overrepresented overall, necessarily, in a particular instance, but can have even just a residual effect, namely, for example, in religion, whether it's their own Judaism or their derivatives, their sword Islam, or their shield red cape false opposition Christianity. The effect of that, perhaps indirectly, is opening up your British borders, for one thing. It's saying there shouldn't be a difference. Listen to what your Queen says in her speeches, her Christmas Eve speeches. That's just one thing. And then you talk about money. Okay, they're not the only rich people. They're not the only traders. But, you do have your Rothschilds, your Warburgs, and whomever, just many fabulously wealthy. What's his name? Abramovich, someone who's there now. And the power that gives them to pay off, to incentivize and pay off and right-wing traitors that you are saying, oh, these are the bad ones. They're being told, oh, you're just objectively superior. You're smarter than everybody else. You don't have to care about their borders. These are just working class peons. They're racists. Right? So there's the second aspect of money. And then there's politics, which is going to be influential, which is going to be allow them to manipulate through the money. And there's academia. Don't tell me there's not heavy kosher influence in British academia, all academia, and academia as it circulates back to Britain, and media. So it doesn't matter if they're not the majority of the people who are doing us, who are opening our borders and bounds. And they will. And then there's the international business and other NGOs, which are in fact, Morgoth has put up a huge list of the organizations which are opening borders and bounds. And you want to say this is not, these people are not to be taken as, a priority concern as in other people, or antagonistic. What am I forgetting? This law and courts. Law and court. I mean, look at what's happened to anybody who dares to open their mouth. Iron Duke. And who's responsible for these laws where you can You can barely say anything. I can't believe you. And then you say Paul Gottfried is on our side. It should be obvious to you or anybody else that he's doing damage control. That he wants you to argue against the left for the reasons that I said. Because that would be the means that we would organize. And he's maybe even not completely consciously working to keep us disorganized. And wants you to believe that if we organize, that this would preclude a feedback mechanism against the calibration of our organization, which would, be looking at the truth of the matter, the nature of the matter, facts, principles to be upheld. Unlike this red cape cartoon that you're chasing of the left, which is only dealing with, quote, narrative and fantastical departure from nature and truth. Iron Duke. Now then, where are we? Let me see if there's anything that else I wanted to say before I go into the talk about the elaboration on the application of hermeneutics, the further application. We did Richard Spencer, we did Edward Dolton and Gavin McGinnis, we did Iron Duke. His formal. Okay, so we'll move on then to an undoing of this red caping of, in this case, hermeneutics. It's our idea. It's a European idea. So that people don't chase the red cape of it the way Iron Duke does or others and react. White knuckle into anxious quest for unassailable foundations. The way Wittgenstein did in the Tractatus, and the way, even lesser minds like Semyagog would try to do with his with his non-arbitrary territorial pissings, because an anthropocentric view is not supposed to be good. We're supposed to have the view of the vegetable or something. Again, like it's supposed to be, like he's overcoming arbitrariness. He's not, or like it's unassailable. Well, it is. One more time, I would agree if people were to say that those who try to say that European peoples are not a venerable pattern, extremely important, warrantably assertable as such, operationally verifiable as such, I would agree. And arguments against it range from silly to disingenuous to evil. But you can argue against it, and that's the point. You can argue. You can say that these borders are contestable. But for example, saying that we can interbreed with other races, therefore, X, etc. Nevertheless, asserting the fact that we have to consciously assert the boundaries immediately implies agency. And since we can't deny that slight modicum of arbitrariness, and it is just a modicum, we can go ahead and make use and enjoy and make use of the agency that it entails, because that takes us into coherence and accountability, oriented assertability, autonomy, and sovereignty. To be managed by, now, what was Samuel God complaining about last night? He said, anybody who says that what makes us human is our capacity for language is just, full of shit. It's only one thing. I wouldn't say that's the only thing. But hermeneutic capacity, conceptualization, analytic ability, conceptual ability, certainly those are among the distinguishing characteristics of humanity. You could say bipedality, but certainly hermeneutics is not to be short shrifted. Just because you have come up with it, you are a reactionary to the kosher rhetoric, so that as you're doing the right wing thing of like language is bad because it's our enemies are skillful rhetoricians. We've got to have pure foundations. Oh, ridiculous. And he wants to get back to the innocence of mood songs and territorial piss. But I'm digressing. And I want to develop hermeneutics, which comes to us by way of Dilthey, Heidegger student Gadamer, and so on. Yes, it's been perverted to no end by kosher academia, but that's what we're trying to that's what we're having to undo here. A proper postmodern application of hermeneutics. So developing the idea or application, as it were, of hermeneutics, its non-Cartesian engagement in the non-linearity of its process of reconstruction and homeostasis, its postmodern sense that is not beholden to a linear course for, quote, progress and pursuit of what is new in yielding some supposed foundation. And what is new then? Good, because it must necessarily lead the way there. So you're endlessly experimenting. That's part of the liberal tolerance for random experimentation rests on the presumption that you don't need control variables, that you're just going to come to some wonderful mulatto foundation or something. Anyway, so as opposed to that, and the aversion to what has been attended to and practiced before, as modernity is wont to do, an aversion that modernity is wont to have, and the pangs of self-loathing for the appearance of conformity, bucking rather the modernist paradox of having to be different in order to fit in, the paradox of improvisation, i.e. the obligation to be spontaneous. That's a paradox, be spontaneous, right? Or planning to be spontaneous. We'll go into discussion of hermeneutic application to the day-to-day problems where the rule structure and capacity of narrative facilitates transcendence of interactive contradictions, confusions, dilemmas, and so on. How are we doing with our audience here? We've got a couple anyway. The rest of you will do well to listen afterward. Now, I was talking last show about how hermeneutics narrative, in the case of individuals, that would be autobiography. In the case of group, of course, it would be our group history and temporal breadth as a system. How they can be, it is necessary and crucial to transcend the mere facticity of moments and episodes, to get into the broader scope of our autobiography, even though we may not be, for example, the winner in a particular moment or episode. We're reframing with our autobiography. Our overall victory in, let's call it the war, if not the battle, right? And the same principle would hold true with our group. That it's necessary to have a hermeneutic which always corresponds with historical breadth to contextualize the overall pattern, so that we can direct our course and take inspiration in our victories and our potential for overall victory, despite episodic, momentary setbacks, even setbacks on a relational level. That is to say, the cultural pattern will be attended to. Now, the rule structuring is not of hermeneutics is not divorced from the empirical world and verification. Of course not, in one way or another. It may not, the rules might not adhere to facts and reality very well. They may digress absurdly, as in the case of like fantastical nonfiction. But on the other hand, they can. This is the difference between, you can say that roughly that's the difference between fiction and nonfiction. They're both narrative. One, however, is simply more adherent and verifiable as factual. The other more speculative, or whatever, or fantastical, imaginative. But that's the point. Even if to be an effectively coherent individual or group, this really crucially applies to our group as well. You need a certain liberation from mere facticity. So they're not frantically, latching on to every empirical fact and trying to adjust on its basis necessarily. You might have to, but their concern is to be coherent along with your emergent forms, that is, or inborn capacities, so that you can be not only of individual but the emergent forms of our group, so that you can be accountable to it, to our inherited forms. And sure enough, our enemies will be using hermeneutics to tangle us up, get us into contradictions, confusions. But if you are, as Heidegger says, engaging in a liberation from mere facticity, from the arbitrary flux of the thrownness of our situation, which can send us in any number of directions in dissolution, at the misdirection of liberals or enemies, or the indifference of the kosher folk, whatever. Yes, our emergence can, if there's a story that our emergence is important and should be held fast to, but that is a story of itself. Yeah, it's generally going to provide guidance to maintaining our kind, but not necessarily. You can even say, from the perspective of an individual, that it's, or even though GW would try to say it's not true, because an individual can say, "Oh, it's in the interest of my children, fitness would have me breed with some other race." It's really narrative understanding of our better qualities that would provide for both a defense against misdirection that would reach that kind of conclusion all too much, and rather point to our overall worthiness and warrant to maintain our species, its homeostasis. It's crucial that, therefore, this liberation from mere facticity into coherence, what Heidegger calls authenticity. Authenticity would conform to emergence. That's whereas coherence would go along with the more autobiographical side of individuality. They're both, in Harre's terms, correctly, I've come to believe, they're both important to attend to in homeostasis management, with our corporeal being and our autobiographical self. They want them to be harmonious. But having established this coherence through a liberation from the arbitrary flux of mere facticity, then we may be accountable, socially accountable, and thereby in rule structure set down our rule structure and establish agency for ourselves. And the group, the same applies to the group. Not only agency, correctivity, and warranted assertability and operational verifiability. All right. Now then, I was saying last time that this hermeneutic capacity allows us to transcend moment and episode where necessary. This came to my attention when I was looking at Gestalt and Fritz Perls and all this talk of, the moment and how important it was to be conscious of the moment. And how ridiculous that is to make that so important. Yeah, okay, you want to be in the moment for a moment, but you also want to have some historical breadth and reflection and concern for what the future might look. Anyway, but I digress. Now, I was saying that how it's necessary to transcend the moment, the episode, both of which might not go in our best wishes. Also, relationships. Many of our people are not doing the right thing, as Iron Duke can see, as anybody can see. And it's not just them. So in order to, for one thing, stave off disillusionment and also their antagonisms, we need that rule structure which will connect us to the cultural pattern, that historical cultural pattern that expresses our venerable qualities from coming down from our forebears. Semi-transcendent. This is not pure transcendent, but it's semi-transcendent of our bad people, of our failed episodes and moments, and connecting that pattern to our legacy, to our children, grandchildren, because you can't, with any good consciousness, allow the little white kids come into a world like this. That becomes this semi-transcendence of narrative, even though it's not always quite empirical and to the eye. Begins to correspond with what we call, the spiritual realm, the spirit of our people, whatever. But we don't have to go there. We don't have to be so kind of mystical in our way of talking to begin with. Now, it's better than that. It's more than that. It's more necessary than that. In a practical sense, the application of hermeneutics. Narrative will allow us to handle not only these momentary and episodic and relational difficulties, reframing them, transcending them, it would allow us to handle, and I'm going to get into this in a moment more deeply, paradox, contradiction, dilemmas, confusions generally, strange and charmed loops, obstructions. Okay. So let me start with the example, one of my more original contributions, and I want to reread it because I think that I left out a little bit in my first reading of the charmed loop of didactic incitement. But it is the kind of, well, if you're in a position, in certain positions where people have power over you, this sort of pernicious charmed loop can be overwhelming. I'm going to explain how in a minute. But it's the concept of hermeneutics and the marshaling of it that helps you out, that can help you resolve this kind of situation. And it's one of the reasons why I come away absolutely disgusted with guest worker at Majority Rights. There's so much. Never mind. I shouldn't even. It's not even worth mentioning. But anyway, I'll discuss in a minute how hermeneutics can help, particularly autobiographical management, can help overcome this challenge that I'm about to articulate. It's called the charmed loop of didactic incitement. And I begin with a quote from Gregory Bateson. He said, We have now reached a moment at which we can begin to know something of the process of this phony and crooked disease in the pathway we are following. At present, I don't think there are very many of us, a few thousand maybe, but this is a very extraordinary epoch in which this knowledge is now becoming a part of the thinking of quite a lot of people. Thank God. Gregory Bateson, Paradigmatic Conservatism. Now, when Bateson says God, he's talking about patterns. I want to be clear about that to begin with. Okay. I developed this hypothesis, which I call the charmed loop of didactic incitement, as an elaboration of Bateson's double-bind hypothesis. I believe that it is at least a component or aspect of what he was thinking about in that statement, specifically where he says, we are beginning to know something of the process of this phony and crooked disease in the pathway we are following. He is alluding to a mechanistic process wherein abuse and exploitation under a phony rubric of, quote, teaching and, quote, lesson giving facilitate quantification of interests accruing to perpetrators, overcoming the borders and boundaries of the victims while the qualitative niche ecological differences of the victims are ground down, any recourse they might take apparently justifying the abuse. Bateson culminates his epic studies, his books, with the question, as teachers, are we wise? And Bateson added, the road to hell can be paved with bad intentions as well. I don't know if I have it here, but it's something about what the altar, that our ideas should not be sacrificed on the altar of pragmatism. But anyway, I digress. I propose the charmed loop of didactic incitement as a useful elaboration on Bateson's double-bind theory. The double bind proposed by Bateson in Toward a Theory of Schizophrenia entails a preliminary paradoxic injunction such as, quote, I am a liar, or, quote, disobey me, or, quote, be spontaneous, as I had mentioned before. This is a preliminary paradoxic injunction, such as I'm a liar, the classic liar's paradox. Then after that is a prohibition of metacommunication. That is a prohibition of talk about talk that might clarify the confusion on a higher level. What do you mean by this? Particularly to clarify goodwill or lack thereof on the relational level of the perpetrator and victim. So you're not allowed to question someone's intention. If they're if they're giving you a paradoxic injunction, like disobey me, like be spontaneous, or I'm a liar, for example. You're prohibited from commenting on the confusion. That's metacommunication, to clarify this. Obviously, we WN are going to be prohibited metacommunication across the internet. We're not going to be allowed to clarify anything, are we? Anyway, but I digress. Then there's a tertiary reframing which prevents escape from the circumstance. For example, a child as dependent upon their parents cannot easily escape the field and is therefore confronted with an intolerable choice between confidence in one's own perceptions as accurate on the one hand, or necessary relations on the other. And so a choice between protecting their capacity for sensible judgment or the relationship. One or the other. This is an intolerable choice for a child. As mammals, relationships are profoundly important. And so the victim of this double bind begins to manifest communicological pathologies in a futile attempt to protect the necessary resource of their faculties, as one cannot not communicate. This, by the way, was an important piece as it took psychology out of the head. Our morons over at Majority Rights, for example, would want to keep it, apparently, in their Cartesian anxiety, and places it into interaction. So it's if for no other reason, an important conceptual piece. This is from the early 50s. But there's no apparent way out to one in this situation. As one proves now I'm going into my elaboration on this. As one proves the cruelty of the didactic incitement is justified, no matter what recourse is taken. Didactic incitement, that is to say, abuse under the rubric of teaching and making one tough, particularly if it is overdone and there is not enough contextual force over the victim to keep them from escaping the field, and there is enough contextual force over the victim to keep them from escaping the field, can create a reflexively recursive phenomenon of a pernicious charmed loop. Let me read that again, since I botched it. Didactic incitement That is to say, abuse under the rubric of teaching and making one tough, particularly if it is overdone and there is enough contextual force over the victim to keep them from escaping the field, can create a reflexively recursive phenomenon of a pernicious charmed loop. No matter what avenue of escape the victim chooses, they will lose and only add to the warrant of the perpetrator's recursively accruing interests. The charmed loop of didactic incitement. That's going to be a tiny bit repetitious. I'm sorry, I'm going back in. Because it's adding facets to the double bind theory. There are some infamous command paradoxes known of psychology. I am a liar, be spontaneous, disobey me. I might add, be a man, would seem to be yet another form, as one is taking orders and not really in power, not really the man, are they? I would like to submit the hypothesis that one is not in a sufficiently powerful position that they are susceptible to a charmed loop of didactic incitement. Unlike the classic paradox, paradoxia, two faces, is the etymology of that, this one seems to split four-way and may more characteristically unfold over time. That is, you're not caught up episodically. I think most double binds are not sheerly episodic. They occur over time in a relationship and recursively reconstruct, keeping the victim bound in. Nevertheless, there is no apparent way out, as one proves that the abuse of the didactic incitement is justified, no matter what recourse is taken. Excuse me. One is a wimp if they do nothing in response. The abuse is justified as one proves their own ineffectiveness. I guess you could say that Johnny Depp took the wimp way out. 2. One is a pig if they respond, fighting back directly in their self-interest. One justifies abuse as they reveal their primitive self-interest and lack of restraint. You see, I knew that was in you all along. You're a pig. 3, you're a dupe. A dupe if they try to reason and bargain with the inciter. One justifies the abuse in this case, and they risk the hideous result of sharing the best they have with the persons treating them the worst, in an attempt to reason with them or by sharing resource, perhaps precious resource. Forms of having the 10 taken in the prisoner's dilemma scenario come into play. Well, again, like you would marry someone like Amber Heard, and you're sharing the best you have, and you're being treated the worst, and you're in the hideous predicament of not only sharing the best you have, but he's trying to bargain with her, or tried to bargain with her, and to the tune of millions upon millions of dollars, and his reputation. Now, there's a fourth bad option in the charmed loop of didactic incitement, which is a permanent puerile initiate. The instigators, others, can always treat the abuse as a quote lesson, and one might be left with little choice but to treat the didactic incitement as an experience not that bad at worst, if not a necessary lesson or even an inspiration, which in fact takes credit for the achievement that you might enact despite this, thereby justifying the abuse, in this case also. Hence the term blue of didactic incitement. You really need them to abuse you in order to achieve. And if you do manage to achieve, you're as much saying, well, your abuse wasn't that bad because I survived, and so it's really hard sometimes not to justify their abuse. Do you see? Oh, wasn't that bad? You're okay. Johnny Depp's okay. Or, yeah, I shouldn't use his example too much. That's pretty trivial. Nevertheless, I'd like to give the readership a clue. It's probably not impossible, not an impossible situation for the victim in most cases, at least not if granted some time. The perpetrators have to have a quantum of power to hold enough contextual force over the victims. But note, there is this, what is, a four-way bind that can happen to a victim with enough contextual force, enough relational force over an individual, and perhaps, let's say, over a group. And it can fly under the rubric of teaching. And I believe that's why the ultimate statement in Bateson's texts is actually a question. He finishes with a question. As teachers, are we wise? Because when you enforce this didactic incitement and destroying boundaries of people and groups, quantifying things to your sociopathic self, you're putting systems into runaway. You're destroying patterns. I have a comment here before I move on that I don't know if I should read, but I will. Okay. I usually find that I underrate my writing. Well, pragmatic intervention analogous to rape orgasm. A form of didactic incitement in therapeutic intervention. A coy treatment of angry reaction of the patient, as if his objections are the expression of the oppressor, subverting the resistance by the suggestion that he is oppressive, the despotic one for trying to defend himself and his agency, and with enough logical force, pressure the liberation from responsibility for what is being imposed on him by the one bit of clear advice. Do you know how to teach a woman? What I'm talking about is a form of the deliberately manipulative therapeutic technique of pragmatic intervention. Practical force overcomes the prefigurative force, as practiced by Haley Week and Waxlick, Milton Erickson, without really knowing what the patient wants or thinks. I was speaking for myself, and only knowing myself well enough in retrospect. I'm a one-woman guy. You know, when I hear these people saying that, you know, all guys just want to go out and score as many women as possible, well, it sickens me because it simply isn't true. Depends, and especially not in this context. Ew. You want Amber Heard after, you know, she answers affirmatively Snoop Dogg's question? I don't want her. Yuck. This is a bit of a digression. Anyway, but and then I heard Joseph Cotto, you know, flouting the people who follow Nick Fuentes as you know, undesirable betas and who can't get women. And what does he say? What did he suggest that you know, his implication is that they should just you know, somehow accept that fact, I guess, or, you know, deal with it. He says that if they think that if a more traditional society comes back, that they are going to have a better chance at a woman or something. And all of this takes for granted a disorganized society. In an organized society, there would be a means to pair people up fairly. So, yeah, okay, maybe some of the people who follow Nick Fuentes would not be very attractive men to women, to most women. But are there not women who are they're equals in unattractiveness who would be appropriate partners? So does Joseph Cotto mean to say that they should continue, those women who are less attractive should continue to stand on line for the alphas? Ridiculous. Anyway, so there's this taken for granted that we should teach men how to be R selectors, and that they, you know, there's this natural fallacy that the only thing they could possibly want is to score as many women as possible. Gavin McGinnis will tell you that. So without really knowing what the patient wants or thinks, the frustration and confusion of everything that he can say is induced, and then one clear bit of advice is given. Do you know how to teach a woman? So that rather than trying to find the correct woman, you are more random and find ones less selectively to begin with. You know, you're being maneuvered from prefigurative force into practical force to begin with one idea, that you might teach her how to be your partner. No, it's change her, not try to find the right woman. Now you've been lured in with a woman that you don't really like, of course, and she's not going to appreciate the pedantry, the pedanticness of teaching her, and you're in less position to expect a virgin wife, are less empowered to object to society's promotion of low sexual standards. The intervention is based on a stupid assumption that a man could only be angry about society because he can't get laid. But doesn't that infuriate anybody with any sense? And isn't it a common thing? Like someone stupid like Conops would say something like that, or Domingo. Oh, these guys, it's very typical. Oh, they're just angry because they can't get laid. It's not, you're not angry with society and with our borders being thrown up, our treasures of every which kind being plundered. No, you're just angry because you can't get laid. This is what they, how they want to think of men. I told Naomi that what she had done was analogous to rape, holding a woman down, fingering her clitoris, producing an orgasm and a hysterical reaction, saying, there, she's had pleasure and a hysterical reaction. She's happy. Moreover, in order to stop the torment and assert one's dignity in response, this can opener-like mechanism, one begins to divulge uncultivated philosophical resource, some quite self-indicting, of course, as it is in raw form, while other aspects can become the stuff of market personalized theory, held as it can potentially be transformed to merit public accord, a treasure in its own right besides what was raped, one's most personal prerogative, laid at the feet of the interventionist in seeking relief, seeking a human response from the deliberately manipulative interventionist. But you can't object, because spilling out along with that is the raw, uncultivated will to retaliate. You are eminently blackmailable. You can't object to what's going on. Okay. So you can say that one is tangled up in paradoxes, in the disorder of modernity, or one might be, in the mere facticity and the flux, the arbitrary flux. No, Kant was anticipating this as well and trying to provide a way out of it. He was some help, but he did not succeed where the hermeneuticists would. A couple hundred years later, his principles and his universal principles were still Cartesian. Now, I hope this doesn't take too much time to read, because I don't have that much time remaining on my StreamYard, and I gotta save some time to talk with Per and Mirth, and maybe Snork. I don't have that much time left until the 22nd of June, but I have some for now. Hopefully I'll be able to read through this, but Ram Harre, late professor from Oxford and Georgetown, was a cognitive psychologist and philosopher of science. Now it's important to note, and this is something that some ignoramus like Guestworker would never acknowledge, not Bauer either. That Harre was a philosopher of science, so it wasn't and a cognitive scientist. So it wasn't as if he wasn't attending to the brain and corporeal being. That would be one thing that he would look at, of course. But he recognized that there were two aspects, when dealing with individuals, there were two aspects that you had to deal with for a normal human life. One is, okay, our corporeality, our corporeal function, but the other was autobiographical. GW over there, majority rights, stupidly tried to tell me that, to just put the autobiographical aside. When something has effectively saved your life, you're not going to put it aside just because some jealous idiot like guest worker says so. So the fact is that Harre would deal with the empirical physical side, but he also has written about the autobiographical, which is the hermeneutic expression of selfhood, and because that was kind of information that was sorely lacking among boomers like you have over there with Bowery and guest worker and so on. That's what I bought. It's not a denial of the emergent. It's not a denial of the physics, but it's a crucial aspect of our individual and group coherence, which is the first task of any individual and group in the world, to achieve coherence so that you can have accountability, correctivity, homeostasis, warrant. All right. Let me read this piece from Ram Harre that he wrote with this feminist lady, Bronwyn Davies, from the University of New England, Australia. She didn't contribute anything much to the first part of this, I don't think. Anyway, Harre came away saying that he's not going to be able to make his program work with feminism. So the fact that she's a co-author is not particularly important, I don't think. The title of the article is "A Contradiction in Lived and Told Narratives." Now, Ram Harre, again, is a philosopher of science and psychology, professor at Oxford and Georgetown. Notable ideas are ethnogenics and positioning theory. Okay. Introduction. The ubiquity of contradiction in human affairs has long been commonplace. Social contradictions were identified by Marx as the source of social change. Repertoires of mutually contradictory personas have been demonstrated to be characteristic of people living in complex societies. Argyll, 1976, DeWale and Harre, 1976. At the same time, it is evident that there have also been powerful social norms requiring at least the appearance of consistency in displays of character, in modes of talking and writing, even in patterns of thought. Research on Language and Social Interaction, Volume 2, 1991-1992. Pages 1 through 36. Though contradiction is a logical concept that names a relation between propositions, it has a well-established use as a general metaphor for incompatibilities of many kinds. It is one of the concepts by which, quote, modernity has been defined. So, in postmodernity, one would expect at least some of the uses of contradiction to be called into question, particularly those in which it has a normative role. According to Parker, 1989, page 48, modernity itself is contradictory. Its discourse promises scientific truth as the solution to humanity's problems on the one hand, and on the other hand attributes responsibility and the power to making meaning to individuals. We too, meaning Ram Harre and Bronwyn Davies, as individual authors, have been both constituted by and active participants in the construction of that modern world. We now find ourselves fascinated by the spaces opened up by its deconstruction, particularly in the work of feminist authors such as Whedon, Walkerdine, Hogg. This paper then stands at the interface between the modern and postmodern worlds. Now, those feminists he just named, or some of them I happen to know, are pretty horrible, but it doesn't matter. It's not going to be relevant, as you'll say. This is not about feminism at all. While still being caught up inevitably in the discursive practices of the modern world, we nonetheless wish to make contradiction a topic for examination in light of such feminist postmodernity, post-structuralist writing. Again, he's calling it feminist. It's not. They're just attaching the feminist label onto the application of hermeneutics. You'll notice that. Oh yeah, well, it's a feminist. No, it's not. There's nothing necessarily gender about it at all. I'm just noting how ridiculous that is. Anyway, let me read on. As a person in our contemporary world, one has access to many ways of talking about oneself and one's activities in that world. That is, one has access to multiple forms and styles of discourse. These ways of telling may remain discrete, and the contradictions that sometimes exist between them may not become manifest nor present problems for resolution or accommodation. But they may overlap, they may be used as parts of some larger whole, and within that whole they may be profoundly contradictory. Furthermore, each discourse may itself be made up of contradictory elements. Billig and others in 1988 give the example of liberal discourse containing ideological commitments to the rights both of the individual and the collective. He also cites educational discourse which espouses as values both equality and authority. In each case, there is a discrete discourse containing oppositional and contradictory imperatives. Yet one of the predominant features of ways of producing ourselves as persons in the modern world is to present what we do as relatively coherent. Again, this is the first task of authentic being, at least according to Heidegger, and I would have to agree. If you're going to be something other than an animal arbitrarily reacting to, or less, just some sort of organism responding to the arbitrary flux of circumstance, you have to begin to make coherent sense, do you not? So let me read that again with that understanding. How important the liberation from mere facticity is. This is not a feminist concept. It's a hermeneutic concept coming by way of Dilthey and Heidegger and Gadamer and other students. Yet one of the predominant features of ways of producing ourselves as persons in the modern world is to present what we do as relatively coherent and non-contradictory, both as we interpret what we do and in the various accounts that we give of what we have done and will do. Numerous strategies exist for dealing with blatant contradictions in those productions. For instance, there is the bureaucratic device of wearing different hats. Each hat represents a different set of constraints, aims, and repertoires of proper actions. The movement from the complex array of lived experiences to the relatively coherent stories that we tell about that experience will be a central focus of this paper. Like Hogg 1987, we see lived experience as inherently contradictory in the appearance of coherence and non-contradiction as discursive constructions. Now that's true. I mean, it's generally agreed that you can't avoid paradoxes. They are ubiquitous. Just that you have to be able to deal with them. As Hogg, 1987 puts it, human beings in the process of their socialization work at restructuring the given elements of their lives until such time as their existence becomes relatively uncontradictory. In other words, until social action becomes possible. That's when you're bound up in these contradictions that can be paralyze you from acting. We wish to explore how it is that non-contradiction has become such a fundamental requirement of the production of self, and in contrast, how the recognition of contradiction has been greeted by post-structuralist authors in particular as fundamental to understanding their experience. Told and lived narratives. Told narratives, including both the stories one tells about oneself and other people, and those narrations we call literature and drama, are generally framed within coherent conventions of discourse and tend to show each character as continuous and often, though not always, as predictable. The purpose of told stories in everyday life is often to show how conflict and contradictions have been, might be, or even should be dealt with. This is Sabini and Selfer, 1981. Told stories are usually finite and well-marked beginnings and endings, with well-marked beginnings and endings. An orderly state of affairs is interrupted by the appearance of a predicament. A course of events unfolds in which the problem is resolved, and a new orderly state of affairs comes into being. Harre, 1979. Such stories appear as accounts, told versions of events that are used retrospectively to order the complex array of lived experiences. As Hogg, 1987 says, we are not assuming that human beings live according to plan or in continuities, nor even that they are always determined by the same consistent factors. Continuities are manufactured respectively in the mind. One focuses in this paper is on those discursive practices through which intelligibility and warrantability are created. Notice this use of warrantability, like I use it. That's the pragmatist Deweyan way. Lived narratives. Again, I'm not. He's someone to guess. He's beholden to every jot and tittle of John Dewey. No, I take what's good from a philosopher. Oh God. Lived narratives. So that was told narratives. Now we're on lived narratives. Told stories are the means of providing the narrative frameworks through which we interpret strips of lived experience as they occur. That is, they serve to guide the actions that make up lived narratives. Who one takes oneself to be at any one time and what one takes oneself to be doing for essential parts of the lived narrative. One's actions are played out with interactive others who provide one with, and whom one provides with, subject positions in the collective flow of talk. These positions may be taken up or refused, however difficult that refusal might be, by any one of the members of the momentary collective. Thus, lived narratives inform readings of told narratives, and told narratives inform lived narratives. Bruno, 1986, Davies, 1989, Davies and Harre, 1990. Discourse as constituted by speakers and constitutive of those speakers. How are we doing with our audience here? Oh, we got a few anyway. That's good. You're lucky. You're participating in the right stuff, the real right stuff. Well, this article's not so much longer, but it's going to take some more minutes to read. Discourse as constituted by speakers and constitutive of those speakers. As Potter and Weatherall pointed out, discourse and discourse analysis have been used in such a wide variety of ways and in such a wide variety of disciplines that it is possible to have 2 books on discourse analysis with no overlap in content at all. In this paper, we draw upon 2 apparently opposite but inherently interwoven uses of the term. One is discourse as practice or discursive practices, the analysis of which involves the examination of stretches of talk. Our particular interest in examining such stretches of talk is to discover the ways that people are constituted and constitute themselves as people and as particular kinds of people in that talk. But we also use discourse as a noun to refer to the way in which particular ways of speaking have been institutionalized, have taken on a life of their own, have in fact become constitutive of people and their actions. This dual use is fundamental to the contradictions we daily live out between ourselves as individuals and ourselves as members of a number of collectives. See the Schotter, 1987. As individuals in the modern world, we choose our words, we shape our meanings, we constitute ourselves in our acts of speaking. We create the social world by speaking it into being. At the same time, every act of speaking is a social act. As Schotter says in 1987, any attempt on my part to enact my own plans and desires must be informed by the activities of those around me. We need to be in particular contexts or we become confused. Those contexts are created in large part by the discourse practices that we are regarded. Those contexts we are created in large part by the discursive practices that are regarded by the individual participants as required or appropriate within the context. The participants discursively constitute the context and thus create and maintain its existence. In the institutionalization of that existence, they bring into being the various discourses through which meaning is made. People are controlled and through which the social world and the individuals who make it up are constituted. Weed in 1987 brings both of these uses of discourse together in her analysis of Foucault's use of the term. Discourses in Foucault's work are ways of constituting knowledge, together with the social practices, forms of subjectivity and power relations, which inhere in such knowledges and the relations between them. Discourses are more than ways of thinking and producing meaning. They constitute the nature of the body, unconscious and conscious mind, and emotional life of the subjects they seek to govern. Neither the body nor thoughts and feelings have meaning outside their discursive articulation, but the ways in which discourse constitutes the minds and bodies of individuals is always part of a wide network of power relations, often with institutional bias. Now, before somebody bites my head off, social constructionism here would be going almost to toward an extreme, which is in the not denying facts, but in the determination of how facts count. This, of course, this is one end of the hermeneutic circle. Granted, that particular author would be less concerned than perhaps they should be with empirical verification, but we're not guilty of that. Let's move on. In the modern world, however, discourses have generally been understood as transparent descriptions of a real world. The task of adults is to socialize children to fit into that real world. In a postmodern, post-structuralist analysis, discourse is understood as constitutive through participating in the discursive practices of the collective and doing so from the positions made available to them. As male or female, for example, individuals are constituted and reconstituted as they move from one context to another, one positioning to another, one discourse to another. To the extent that people do not use or see a particular institutionalized discursive practice as malleable tools for achieving their own ends, but rather treat them as reflecting the way in which the world is, then those ways of speaking, those discourses, provide specific prescriptions for what it means to be a person, and specific positions for specific categories of person within them. These prescriptions and positionings then have material consequences for the persons caught up in them. Harre and Harre, 1990. In the modern world, a contradictory statement is generally taken to be a signal of faulty socialization. The person has not learned to understand the way the world is and should be, and thus engages in faulty, though remediable performances. In a post-structural analysis, the person who makes a contradictory statement is more likely to be seen as being positioned within and constituted through contradictory discourses. In this model, it is not the person who needs remediation, nor even the statement, but rather the discourses themselves, with their contradictory assumptions or imperatives, which can be examined, understood, accepted, challenged, resisted, or changed. The implications of this for the individual are twofold. One, increased insight into one's own subjectivity in all its complexity, and as it is constituted through varied and contradictory discourses. Or two, increased political competence in dealing with unacceptable subject positions, since their creation can be located within particular discourses. So hopefully you're beginning to sense the potential utility of this hermeneutic way of this hermeneutic analysis. Next rubric, life models. The Enlightenment model, or the E model, is the predominant discourse in the modern world. It presents as an ideal a rational person leading a rational life in a rational universe in which contradictions must always be eliminated. According to Godwin, 1798, succinctly expressing the Enlightenment ideal, reason is the, quote, reason is the only legislator, and her decrees are irrevocable and uniform. The E model is based on the assumption of an orderly universe existing independently of human perception, which is simply described by the use of appropriate forms of language. The person in this model is conceived of as a unitary and relatively fixed being. A person making contradictory statements or expressing contradictory beliefs or engaging in contradictory practices is seen as aberrant, their behavior calling in question their claims to adult human status. The quote, dissonance reduction tradition in social psychology, inaugurated by Festinger and Abelson in 1968, is clearly built around an unexamined consensus, which is in favor of the E model, the Enlightenment model. It is instructive to look back to the heyday of consistency theories. According to McGuire in 1968, a human task is to maintain the internal consistency of the belief system. People do not simply minimize inconsistency, but they maximize consistency. This latter implying that they seek maximal interconnectedness in their belief system. McGuire, 1968. The search for consistency is thus presented as a natural human tendency. The thought that it might be a local social imperative appears to cross no one's mind. Tenenbaum, 1968, says, for example, it is the state of incongruity between expressed attitudes and a person's subsequent actions which generates a pressure for change in the attitude toward either the source or the concept, but always in the direction making for a newly congruent situation. making for a newly congruent situation. I don't think so. It is as if this pressure for congruence were both individual and natural. In contrast, many adherents to the post-structuralist model, or the P model, regard contradiction as an inherent feature of human life. To rule out or not recognize the phenomenon of contradiction is to reduce the quality of thought and to impair the quality of lived experience. Again, to take a passage from Hogg, 1987, quote, "Our perceived need for harmony is particularly detrimental to the expression of our knowledge. Like wishful thinking, the need for harmony ornaments ugly inconsistencies. The price we pay for the elimination of contradictions is acquiescence to a kind of narrow-mindedness." The P model, presuming the social world to be produced through talk and other symbolic exchanges, presents a human individual as caught in a number of discursive nets. One of these is the E-net, or the Enlightenment net. The Enlightenment net is unique in that it requires a coherence in thought and action, which belies not only the inherent contradiction in any one net, but also the co-presence of the other nets. It denies them. These nets are complexities of concepts, storylines, and metaphors through which human beings present themselves publicly and privately as persons. People in this model are not unitary beings uniquely positioned, but produced as a nexus of subjectivities and relations of power which are constantly shifting. These shifts occur within and between discourses as persons are positioned and position themselves in their interactions with others. Within and between these discourses and the positionings within them, people experience contradictory imperatives for action, contradictory emotions, contradictory perceptions, and contradictory ways of thinking. What we argue in this paper, then, is that the Enlightenment model describes in some fundamental detail the product of humanness. Emphasis on product. The product as that is discursively constituted in the modern world. Now remember, social constructionism discusses the genesis, the source of products, whereas social constructivism, that's a big difference, discusses the product. The more advanced are social constructionist, not social constructivist. In the Enlightenment model, the individual is constituted as a unitary, rational being who is separate from the social world and its discursive practices. That separation is fundamentally implicated in the requirement that the individual take on the responsibility of making meaning and moral responsibility for the coherence of self. In this model, words are understood as the transparent tools with which to describe that self and the separate world in which it is located. What the P model gives us, in contrast, is a different way of viewing persons and the inevitable contradictions in their productions of self. This is done by shifting the focus from the person, as person ought to be within the Enlightenment model, to the various discourses through which persons are constituted. What we will show in this paper are some of the strategies to use to maintain the E model as the orderly base on which the social world is organized, at the same time calling in question the inevitable essentialism attendant on such a model. How are we on our time? We've been going for 2 hours and 10 minutes. I'll leave us some time anyway. The P model, in the feminist version of it, does not involve, I'm sorry that feminist word, again, that's irrelevant, it's ridiculous. The post-structuralist model does not involve a mindless, even amoral welcoming of multiple selves, along with the loss of creative tension created by the E model. demand to find a resolution between the multiplicities. Rather, it involves a recognition of the inevitability of contradiction in the world, made up of contradictory discourses, and provides a fundamental shift in the definition of self such that the contradictions are not experienced as a personal flaw, but as ways of constituting the social world, which are themselves amenable to change. I speak myself into existence through the discourses available to me. I know myself through the stories I live and the stories I tell. Each of these deeply implicated in the other. And so I can choose with others to change the stories and to develop new ways of talking about them. Equally, I can refuse discourses that speak me into existence in ways I no longer wish. That refusal is dependent on my ability to see the way in which my identity is discursively constituted. Fundamental to this model is a skewing of role as a means of interpreting behavior. Whenever I and me are separated out, then the personal and private I can justify separate social worlds in which the various public me's play out the different and contradictory roles that society demands. This separation is one that has always found that authors have always found unconvincing and somewhat immoral. In rejecting the division between the public and the private as a legitimate and meaningful division, they have owned their various me's and have not reserved these as distinguished as or have not reserved these or distinguished them from some other, quote, real self. Perhaps this very reason authors have found contradiction much more personally troubling as they try to integrate not the authors. Also, the very reason some people have found the contradictions much more personally troubling as they try to integrate the unintegratable into one unified rational whole me, as the E-model leads them to believe they should. It is almost inevitable then that those troubled that in particular have greeted the post-structuralist model with enthusiasm. A critical difference, though, between postmodern writing and P-model writing is that the feminists have not tended to fall. Jesus, I forgot how much feminist stuff is in here. It's really irritating to me because I know this stuff, and that the feminist label is just a tack on, almost like the way that someone who's riding the wave of more advanced theory will, oh, this is Jewish. It's like, no. There's nothing gender about this application of hermeneutics. Harre apparently felt obligated to talk this way in this article. Anyway, a critical difference, though, between postmodern writing and those who have not tended to fall into the relativistic, amoral enemy of much of the non-postmodern writing. The critical difference is that they have not tended to fall into, that these postmoderns have not tended to fall into the enemy. Rather than the depressed, so there is no me of postmodernism, they have said with enthusiasm. So this is how I get to be all these things and have understood this. I now see how I can begin to change them. So I'm not denying a core self. If I may elevate this somewhat dated article, say, that social constructionism and hermeneutics don't deny a self, even a more or less core self. What they'll go on to say is that they can see how it would be recontextualized, and contradictory components managed and harmonized. We'll go on to see. The press towards non-contradiction of both told and lived narratives in the modern world. The practical everyday social order. In order to know how to speak, to achieve intelligibility and warrantability in what one says on any particular occasion, one must be able to make assumptions both about oneself and about the other people involved in the conversation. Some of these assumptions are included in Grice's conversational implicatures. In addition to these, one must know what discursive practice it would be proper to adopt for this conversation and how to position oneself and other conversants appropriately. In most conversations, the issue of the nature of oneself at the moment of speaking is not an overt topic. In order that issue should remain in the background, and the actions of all those engaged in the production of the strip of life then being lived, speakers require of each other that they present themselves as knowable and predictable. Moral orders. There's that concept again, which calls into question the whole idea. Just the thought of it calls into question the whole idea that Christianity is the moral order. Well, it did for me anyway, when Harre spoke to my class and used the term moral orders. It was like, oh yeah. There's moral orders, plural. There are different ways of organizing social moral order. Moral orders. The social definition of a sane adult person is that they accept responsibility for what they say and do. It is assumed within such a definition that such persons choose their actions in accordance with some set of moral principles. That this social ontology of selves is a social construction is evident from the fact that the idea of human individuals as absolute moral agents in control of their lives is relatively recent, as per 1986. In locating the source of action in choosing individual rather than in fate or the social order or in discourse, a constraint is evidently placed on the thoughts and actions of each person, namely that they should make a coherent whole whose actions can consistently be accounted for within some moral order. Schools, law courts, and psychiatric clinics are institutions in which those who have not learned to produce acceptable accounts of their actions are taught to do so. Those who never manage it are generally removed from the social world. The linguistic order. Although people produce discursive practices and discourses, those practices and structures in turn produce them. As a speaker, a person is a kind of point, the location in an array of speakers at which a socially significant event, a speaking, has occurred. I and you index speech actions with locations in that array. What someone has said, is saying, or will say is not just the words they utter, but the social meaning of those words, jointly constructed by speakers and those with whom they converse. Since one of one's interlocutors is oneself, those aspects of individual minds that are conversational in character must share a basic structure with public discourse. A mind must then be organized around a self-identical conversational point, and its dynamics must share many of the features of the local discursive practices of which it is a and the features of the local discursive practices of which it is a partially concealed product. A further consistent feature of the discursive practices we use is their constitution of the categories male and female as exclusive, oppositional categories around which each person's identity is organized. Individual people are not free to reject these categories as linguistic impositions, since their maleness or masculinity or their femaleness or femininity is defined as natural rather than as discursively produced. Of course, now everybody is, the right wingers are all too familiar how that concept can be abused, which in its benign initial form would help people deal with the fact that much of their self and personality is not also a matter of gender differentiation, and it shouldn't necessarily be the task to be, it shouldn't be required and burdened if they're not manifesting the most flamboyant expression of masculinity if they're a man, or femininity as a female. And I would argue, in fact, that requirement can be very much a burden and a bad one. That very masculine men can be a drag, and as can very feminine women. At any rate, nature is going to call us back into balance anyway if we won't manage our own the homeostasis of a natural state of a natural optimal balance of gender differentiation. Not arguing for homosexuality or that you can make up sexual differentiation out of thin air. That's not the point. The point here is they're focusing on the autobiographical side of gender differentiation. Not. I mean, you can argue that this guy who dresses as a woman is a woman because he decides to be by his autobiography, but you're going to be rightfully looked upon as crazy. So that stuff shouldn't be imputed to social constructionism properly done. But I digress. Singularities and multiplicities of self. This paper depends on an understanding. This paper depends on an underlying psychological theory of personhood, according to which selves are nothing but the forms in which persons and as embodied speakers present themselves in social action, particularly speech. The fact that human awareness is reflexive, that is, that people can come to pay attention to their own thoughts and actions, means that the possibility exists of presentation of oneself to oneself. In general, the reflexive self-preservation has the same form or forms as public self-preservation. One tells oneself the story of one's life according to the variance of the same grammatical and narratological conventions as one tells the story to someone else. Private and public self-presentations are discursive acts, and the way these acts are performed are discursive practices. All discursive practices, at least in English, include the use of formal singularities such as the use of common subject of predication, I, my, mine, for all of the person's reminiscence. They also include categorical singularities such as the qualification of all of the person's actions as those proper to only one category of person, such as a male or female, adult or child. These discursive practices, through which one publicly presents oneself as a singularity, are matched by and ultimately the source of corresponding beliefs about oneself. How far away from the end here? Well, we're not that far from the end. Okay, good. Because there's a payoff here. How we're doing on our one, it's still a few. Okay, good. Generally speaking, it has been assumed by traditional psychologists and social constructionists alike that people have one and only one personal identity. That is, they act as if they are and believe themselves to have both formal and categorical singularities. The unitary, non-contradictory self within the enlightened model as natural and called into question in the post-structuralist model must be distinguished from the formal and categorical singularity of persons. Formal singularity is in fact a logical prerequisite for the experience of contradiction. Preservation of the concept of identity as a psychic and presentational singularity is a necessary condition for anyone to be able to experience or talk about psychic and presentational multiplicity. That one be continuously embodied in the same flesh is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the possibility of experiencing or being seen as engaging in sufficient acts. Formal singularity as one and the same speaker must also be maintained. There is no contradiction, for example, between a person being assertive and a person being submissive unless they are understood as the very same person. That understanding is ensured by the discursive maintenance of oneself as the very same speaker. The centrality of this singular formal identity to the way people are discursively produced can be grasped more readily if we examine cases where this formal singularity is absent, most notably in cases of multiple personality. Many of us could be said to have such multiplicities, but these go unnoticed because the different selves are played out in different contexts, and so need not call in question our discursive production of ourselves as a formal singularity. In some cases, however, such multiplicity is regarded as pathological. That assessment seems directly related to a failure to discursively produce oneself as a formal singularity, or at least to show oneself to be striving to find a way of resolving or making sense of multiplicity. Multiple personality disorder case presented here, said to be resolved through phenomenal management. I left that out, okay, and moved on. The problem with meaning of self. Each human being is both a formal singularity and a cluster of discontinuous and discursive psychological and social multiplicities. At least some of the difficulties characteristic of self-studies have come from the persistence of the custom of using the word self, both for the necessary similarity of what is taken to be non-pathological personhood and for the multiplicity of things we are to one another and ourselves. Now, as I've made my way through this stuff, I have to say I don't think it's managing our autobiography is not. It's not nearly that complicated. They're sort of over-analyzing and reifying in place some of the complexities that one kind of would move around naturally in hermeneutic negotiation. Anyway, onward. The interrogative pronoun who, whom shares some of this ambiguity. In the one sense of who, a remark like, I don't know who I am, is patent nonsense, while in another sense it can be used to express those doubts about what sort of person one is and should be, and have come to be called identity crisis. Only if one has a personal identity in the first sense could one have an identity in the second. One way to resolve the ambiguity, as Harre has shown, has been to call one's experience of oneself as a singularity, a sense of self. But these were not felicitous expressions, in part because they tied singularity to subjectivity and multiplicity to objectivity. Whereas there is experienced multiplicity and presented singularity. Unfortunately, self has become the favored word for both aspects of personhood. Our resolution is simple. And this is important to Harre, I've come to agree, even though it would seem Cartesian. He distinguishes between the corporeal self and the autobiographical self. We should call the presented singularity the self one and the presented multiplicities the self two, whether the presentations are private to oneself or public to others. Philosophers have studied the concept of personal identity, self one, in a great detail, while social scientists have been largely concerned with self two. But the two are intimately related. For there to be and there you go. I mean, they are related, so it's not Cartesian, but they do sort of do different things at different times. They can go, for a time, go in different directions. That is your biological corporeal being and your autobiographical being. For there to be a kind of multiplicity of selfhood, which interests post-structuralists, for example, there must be personal singularity of selfhood in the sense of the personal identity of self one. In short, the persistence of integrity of self one is, analytically speaking, a necessary condition for the experience of diversity in self two, the diversity of autobiography. If in the life of one human being there seems to have emerged a diversity of multiplicity of self one, we take the case to be pathological. But the lived experience of diversity in self two is the common form of everyday life. To understand the discursive practices of self-production and presentation, both concepts are needed. The English language must bear some responsibility for these confusions. There is no single Castilian, for instance, into which the English word self, with its attendant and systematic ambiguities, can be translated. A mismo captures self one, but cannot be used for self two. Nor can French moi mina do double duty either. The E model takes as fundamental what we have called the self one and relies on rationality as the means whereby self two can also be made a unitary whole. Hold on, I have to take a break. Be back in about 40 seconds. Okay, back. How are we doing here? All right. Some people remaining. We're just a few minutes away from the conclusion of this article. Again, there's a payoff here. I wouldn't do this to you. Although I admit that if I had more time, I probably would have done you a better service to summarize this article more before reaching the end. Off in the weeds a bit. Nevertheless, since we're almost done, let's finish it up. A self as process and product. The human self that has been the object of study, i.e. the subject of experiments, the actor of symbolic interactionists and ethnogenic ethnographies, the member of the ethnomethodological studies, the man or woman in ethnographies, has, in postmodern terms, cease to exist. All we have left is the text, the process, the moments of production. The self is continually in process. It is created in multiple forms and multiple contexts through multiple discourses. These discourses, these contexts and forms intersect, overlap, inform each other, leak into each other, but a fundamental element of all these discourses is that the self is an object. It is some thing or entity which is subject to and controlled by structures external to itself, and it is something which has willpower, which can make choices, which is morally responsible for its acts. These are more than ways of speaking. They are the ways of speaking through which the person in process is constituted, as human, as an individual, as recognizably one person and not another. Thus we are the product we discursively produce. We are at one and the same time no more than a series of discursive productions, and also that which is discursively produced, the unique individual with thingness in the world. This is the case for both what we have called self-one and self-two. The insight that the thingness is a discursive production appears to make the thingness disappear. How can it have substance, phenomenologically speaking, if at the next moment its substance can change and can be discursively produced or something else? How can it be a thing if it can be simultaneously be two opposite things? How can it be a thing if it can retrospectively become not the thing that we thought it was at that time? The embodiment of ourselves in our corporeal substance, again, Harre doesn't deny our corporeal being, is perhaps part of the conceptual problem. When we refer to ourselves as a thing, we are eliding the two, the apparently solid and relatively unchanging substance of our bodies with the discursively constituted thingness of ourselves. To be embodied as we are is part of the condition for there to be personal identity. This is not to say that the perception of our bodies as solid is not also a social construction. I agree. People don't understand that, but you might explain that. We don't evolve in isolation, like a seed out of the ground or something. And how we count also is, or who we choose as a partner to have babies with. Someone. There's various ways in which it's a social construction indeed, even factually, even if only as how facts come to count. But focus for a moment on the fact that our bodies are perceived generally as having solidity, thingness, substance. If we didn't make this metaphoric link when thinking about ourselves with our bodies, then we would perhaps have less difficulty. If we had a fluid metaphor like water, then we could more readily grasp the fluid, multiple, changing nature of self too. But the perception of solidity or of an embodied self is what we do have. Thus we have self one, a way of speaking the self into existence. We have self two, fluid, multiple, and discursive produced. I don't know how multiple, I don't like this word multiple, but there are multiple possibilities. It's more like a myriad of possibilities. This is kind of like where Harre, and he's been criticized by Harre for this, has sort of like almost a third person picture kind of view. He talks about appropriating multiple possibilities. It's a bit too much of a reification. It's a myriad would be a better word, I think. And the phenomenon, there's different ways to put your autobiography. And a phenomenon, thus we have self one, a way of speaking the self into existence, and we have self two, a fluid, myriad, and discursively produced, and a phenomenological sense of self as solid, as unchanging, as having sense, as having some existence independently of any social construction. This too is discursively produced. In a well-known allegory, Strawson explored the way persons would be formed and modes of identity very different from ours come into existence in a purely auditory world. Hooray, we're finally getting to the point. You know, I began this talk with wanting to provide more examples of the problems that we're confronted with, whether paradox, confusion, tangles, the stuckness and arbitrary facticity that requires liberation, as Harre would, as Heidegger would put it, dilemmas, blockages, obstructions, misdirections, charmed and strange loops. How autobiography or narrative or the hermeneutic self facilitates overcoming this sort of thing. So, rubric: contradiction and non-contradiction. Contradiction and contrariety within formal logic. According to traditional formal logic, in order for there to be a contradiction, there must be a conjoint assertion of two propositions, which are so structured that if one is true, false, and the other must be false, true. Leaving aside tautologies, the following conditions must be satisfied. When both propositions must have the same numerically identical logical subject. 2, both propositions must refer to the same moment in history of the logical subject. 3, the predicates must stand in the same kind of exclusion relation. For instance, they might be different determinants under the same determinable hues under color, or they might refer to a set and part or all of its complement, sheep and non-sheep, for example, goats. Contraries are statements which cannot be true together through a pair of contraries. Though a pair of contraries are statements which cannot be true together, though a pair of contraries could both be false. For instance, everyone is really good, and no one is really good. Subcontraries are pairs of statements which could both be true but cannot both be false. Some people are nice, and some people are not nice, are subcontraries. Among the many explanations of cultural prohibition on formal contradiction is the thesis that an utterance and its contradictory cancel each other out, so nothing is finally said, no speech act is achieved. But in real life, the statement that follows but contradicts another statement is usually not to be taken as a taking back of what was said in the first statement, but as an additional truth. Often both statements are intended by the speaker to be taken seriously, and it is the other conversants who inquire about them and resist the contradiction. Whereupon the speaker must do some further work to maintain both statements, or else withdraw one. The ways in which non-contradictory E-type, Enlightenment-type narratives are produced. Challenges to the propriety and intelligibility of accounts usually take the form of reminders that narratives must be coherent and non-contradictory. The following are some of the means by which an incoherent and contradictory storyline offered by an individual person can be maintained or, if necessary, repaired, such that the person can maintain the illusion, both for themselves and for their various audiences, of a unitary, non-contradictory self. That there are so many familiar strategies for getting around inconsistent productions of self indicates that the extent to which the E-type person, the Enlightenment type person, is a discursively constituted rather than a natural being. The strategies bear an interesting relation to the rules of formal logic. Okay, so this is what I'm calling the payoff here, or just some strategies that hermeneutic, the narrative, autobiographical, can help with. One, serialization. To serialize a story is to present potentially contradictory events, states, and so on as occurring at different times. Let me repeat that. One, serialization. To serialize a story is to present potentially contradictory events, states, and so on as occurring at different times. Two, separation. To separate a story is to present apparently contradictory descriptions of events, interpretations, character traits, and so on as belonging to different discourses, and thus as bearing no relation to each other. Three, division. A tale which is incoherent as one person's story may be divided, as in the case of Miss Beauchamp, a case of multiple personalities. Example provided but excised from the text above, such that the apparently contradictory episodes, traits, etc. belong to different persons, the stories of each of which are coherent. A more common form of this is to refer to different roles and the requirements of those roles which bear no relation to the bearer of those roles. At one time I'm a father, at one time I'm a businessman, at one time I'm a participant in a sporting event. These can be contradictory personalities. It's very aggressive in a person when playing rugby, and very gentle and caring with my partner, like that. 4, hierarchicalization. A narrative which includes apparently contradictory claims, whether these be made verbally or displayed in action, can be remodeled to meet the demands of the E-format or modernist style if the claims are reassigned to different levels in a logical hierarchy. For example, one claim may be assigned to a person as a member of a family or a profession or a nation, and the other to that person as an individual. This strategy works on the widely assumed condition that no individual is expected to be an exact exemplification of familial or national stereotypes. Of course I am English, but, and then he follows a descriptive phrase by which a personal characteristic or self is attributed. But I really prefer coffee, which contradicts some component of the assumed stereotype. 5, ironization. To illustrate the 5th strategy, we use a much more complex case in which lived and told narratives interact with one another in the kind of case we have in mind. An episode includes 2 levels of acts. There are those which serve to realize the official storyline. For instance, that the group of people gathered there are conducting a funeral, and there are those which serve to display an ironic detachment from the storyline. We could regard the second string of acts as a kind of told narrative which comments on the performance in the lived narrative. Thus the undertaker's staff might adopt postures which, by their studied casualness, belie the general seriousness and reverence with which they handle the coffin. We call this strategy ironization. It involves a way of showing that one aspect of or performance of a lived narrative, which seems to stand in contradiction to another, is to be taken as an ironic commentary on the major storyline being realized in action. Goffman's description of displays of roll distance pick out perfect cases of what we have in mind. A brain surgeon who chatters about the stock market throughout a demanding operation is behaving contradictorily. The chatter presents a persona which contradicts the seriousness that would be expected from someone accepting the level of responsibility implied by a major storyline of the activity in question. The mirror image of the strategy of ironization is described by Gavin in Stigma when he explains how the autobiographical facts which would contradict current displays of self are hidden or suppressed by various techniques of passing so that a coherent lived narrative is publicly expressed. And this might well be achieved through a told narrative assembling autobiographical fragments to create a certain impression in the hearers. I guess that activists for our cause can certainly use that at times when they're functioning in a context that doesn't allow for us to defend our people, for example. Ignoring. Number 6, ignoring. Most people, most of the time, do not closely monitor the consistency of their own motives or those of others. The illocutionary force of most speech acts remains vague and is only made relatively determinate after the event should some issue of necessary follow-up action arise. But you said we would calls for an examination of consistency and act force. The number of strategies available for dealing with such accusations. I forgot. Did I say that? Was I talking about Katharine Hepburn when actually Snorkel was talking about Audrey Hepburn? Yes. That's what I thought I heard. I wasn't thinking clearly at the time, etc. Indicate the extent of actual lived inconsistency and of contradiction between intention and act. 7. Retrospective, prospective sense of occurrences. Presuming that the meaning will become clear in time as more information is gained. Seven, retrospective, prospective sense of occurrence. Presuming that the meaning will become clear in time as more information is gained. That's not bad. That's giving your own self goodwill. That's confidence. And presuming the goodwill of others. You'll see how this ostensible contradiction will sort out in time, but it's not a contradiction really. 8. A claim of human fallibility. Inconsistent features are a matter of forgetting, of weakness, of cowardice, or psychological disturbance, etc., i.e., temporary features out of keeping with the way a person is or ought to be. 9. A reworking of a discourse. One of the contradictions that postmodernists have written and worried about is between the discursive practices through which they constitute themselves as persons in domestic, for example, women in domestic settings, and those through which they constitute themselves as people in professional settings. Although this contradiction could be handled by many of the above strategies, such as keeping them temporarily separate or ignoring the difference, it has instead been focused on and worked with in a number of productive ways. One of the early catch cries of the movement was the personal as the political. Now, I would say that that's, again, it bothers me how the feminists are taking credit for a good idea, which would really be just sort of radicalizing Aristotle, because as you recall, Aristotle noted that the political is the first among philosophical requirements, because without that organization, that all else will be for naught, unless that is properly arranged. And Heidegger makes an excellent distinction between first and most essential, which I'm now remembering I meant to introduce somewhere in my most recent talks, but I forget what's supposed to come into play right now. Never mind. That's a bad digression. The personal is the political. That's a good idea, but it's going to be made obnoxious and red-caped by its appropriation as, quote, feminist. That's ridiculous. There's not one thing in this article, except for the example of, a woman may be having difficulty negotiating between her professional life and her requirements as a homemaker and a mother. But in the abstract, there's nothing here that is gender specific. It's ridiculous. Anyway, thus personal, private life, and again, Bronwyn Davies was the feminist, not Harre. I gather he was just humoring her, and he did say afterwards that he realized that he could not, that he couldn't make his program work with feminism, with feminists. Thus, personal, private life became something not to be separated out from one's thinking in the workspace, but rather something that must be integrated. Workplace thinking must be able to make sense of one's personal life if it is to be accorded any value. And the thinking, and the thinking one does in one's personal life must not exclude or occlude or negate or contradict the thinking one does in one's professional life. They would have to harmonize, wouldn't they, to make for a happy, well-integrated person. Autobiography. The work done by postmodernists is still being done to bring to bear this person's knowledge on the disciplines they work with, to modify and rework them, has caused a considerable shift in some of those disciplines, thus bringing contradictory discourses to bear on and to modify each other is one of the means of producing non-contradictory E-type narratives. 10, and this is the last example, production of the superordinate discourse. A divine presence is constituted as the source of that which cannot be understood. God moves in mysterious ways. Okay. The inconsistency or lack of orderliness of the events is taken then to be proof of divine presence. That is not particularly articulate. I would say that, as Bateson would, you can count on patterns to sort things out. Bateson would say, I don't have to tell you about the tyranny of patterns. That's the rubric under which we meet, meaning late modernity and the Locketean empiricist program to place the civic individual as or provide them with a means, a technology to liberate themselves from from classificatory bounds, which he saw as tyrannical, and the patterns as tyrannical. But what Bateson is rejoinding is that I don't have to tell you about the tyranny of patterns. That's the rubric under which we meet. What you may not know is that you have to accept them. So you have to accept our biological patterns, our inborn limitations, and the call for homeostasis, not ever-ending achievement and expansion what does Richard Spencer say? The Faustian quest to move beyond our limitations, that sort of bullshit. As I've been saying, like to come back into and manage an optimality of our self-actualization within the social context, recontextualization, the postmodern recontextualization of our group delimitation as the most essential motive, so to speak, in the hierarchy. And Harre would add, and hard to, one might not want to argue with it. The only two realities, the social, our relations, our interaction, and molecules that we might talk about. Again, I think it's very helpful to propose as structuring and stabilizing of this personal and social situation routine sacrament to go along with self-actualization, lest I be incorrectly accused of trying to limit our ambitions for women either. Okay. That's basically it. So you see, whether it's the charmed loop of didactic incitement, or really, this article only doesn't even provide really an exhaustive list of the kind of contradictions that we might be confronted with. My communicological analysis, there are all sorts of, like I said, there's binds, there's loops, there's charmed loops, there's strange loops, there's dilemmas, there's confusions, there's obstructions. So there's prohibitions, obligations, and autobiography or narrative becomes crucial to managing these things. And like I said, for the self-esteem, one good example of white boys who might not be as good as others on a momentary or episodic level. They can reframe it and see how their biology is, in fact, not evolved, nor should it be evolved to be most proficient at those particular acts, but for other things, sublimating for the broader reflection, say, of an engineer or a scientist, that sort of thing. And how our puerile females should be socialized to become women. Fully human women who recognize our value in that pattern transcendent of moments and episodes which might otherwise find us wanting. Okay, I haven't been reading the comments. I'm going to put in the link, not necessarily anticipating anybody to join me today. And I've saved probably enough time on StreamYard, although I have gone for 3 hours now. And I'm going to read the comments, and then if nobody joins me, I'm going to take the opportunity to save time. I said what I wanted to show. Reading that article in full was not Um, maybe not as thoroughly worthwhile as I had hoped, but it's all good. It's just that I don't know that it was quite so necessary. It's one of those I didn't have time to tell a short story affairs to parse out what you might most need to hear. Like Thomas Jefferson said, I didn't have time to send a short letter. Makes the point, though, how, in the end, how narrative autobiography can help to overcome these contradictions, for example, in that case. All right. Wow, there's a lot of comments here. House of Comments and categorical imperative. Jesus. People have been really at it. Okay, I got a thumbs up from Carl Rengel. Categorical imperative. Adventurous white females think it is part of a rite of passage for a white female to suck a black blank. There is a narrative like that. In fact, coming from Simone de Beauvoir, that would correspond with that. She calls it the sacred ministry of betrayal. Quote, "You will never do to me anything as hateful as I have already done to you." That's nasty, and that's in really the sine qua non of feminist texts. Simone de Beauvoir, right there. You could see Madonna in that too, with her like a prayer shit. Categorical. Richard Spencer is begging to be let into the mainstream by openly submitting to neoliberalism and neoconservatism. You said that before, and I think it's true. I think that's actually an astute observation. Categorical imperative. Depeche Mode is so old that Depeche was mispronounced by a female audio announcer recently when announcing the death of one of its members. Categorical imperative goes on to say, one of Claire Cole's Desert Island discs is Break On Through to the Other Side by the Doors. You know, I used to not like the Doors. I used to, be angry and felt that they were overrated. And Jim Morrison was a drunken sort of. I didn't like him so much as a drunken fool. I didn't. At any rate, one thing I maintain is that they don't represent the '60s. They're a band that could have been, from any time. They didn't capture the thing of the age, the being of white men. Not very well. However, I discovered the secret to enjoying the Doors at their best, which is to be drunk. You gotta be drunk like Jim Morrison. It's not a group to listen to so much under the influence of drugs. You really have to be just plastered drunk, and then it's really good. I like Waiting for the Sun, so I like them now, whereas I used to be kind of resistant to them and I used to view them as overrated. Categorical imperative says, Ed Dutton is not an honorable man. His fleeing to Finland from Britain has not served him well. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. Men are advised to defend their homeland in their homeland. I don't think that Finland's a fire. Might have some problems, but nowhere near like Finland has. I think that he just really is kind of a career girl, going right for and playing right into the the framework that's provided for him. Identify his right wing, and here's the left as the enemy. And now you have him, in cahoots with fucking Gavin McGinnis. With any nincompoop should be able to see right through Gavin McGinnis as just a kind of Ezra Levant kind of stooge. I mean, my God, disgraceful. Ed Dutton is a Mason. Could be. No problem with Masons? I don't. And Carl White Wrangler says, imperative, I myself am no Mason. Categorical imperative says, are Jewish and Muslim Masons waiting to tell Christians that Christianity is idolatry and blasphemy, and they must therefore cease and desist if they believe in the Abrahamic God? Categorical imperative. Do you believe that Jesus is God? I sure don't. Categorical imperative. Iron Duke is a dimwit, but he is an army man. Yeah, I guess he can be forgiven as a guy who's just, duty bound, but he certainly, I wish that he would, that he could hear what I'm saying and see how foolish it is to think of Gottfried as a sound guide as opposed to classic misdirection, and that how mistaken he is to downplay the role of the kosher folk in our demise, and more importantly, how it's not mutually exclusive. And this is a point that I didn't make early on. I'm glad to have the occasion to make it now. Not only do they have a crucial play, not only is it not mutually exclusive to our own peoples that are right-wing and neoliberal and liberal traitors, but the fact that we recognize it, whether it's from their biological patterns or from these top-down niches, is a hypothesis, a working hypothesis. Therefore, it's flexible, and it's correctable in terms of the extent to which particular kosher people are culpable, the extent to which they occupy a particular institution, particularly at present, which they maybe not be so present in a lot of places in certain English institutions. But the important thing is, because we're not a Nazi platform, because it's not our objective to kill them, let alone to genocide them, or even to lord ourselves over them. It shouldn't be a problem for us to identify their pejorative role in affairs. We merely see them as a different people, a Middle Eastern people, with different interests, and moreover, a different people, and we're looking after our people. So we are distinguishing them and separating ourselves for our purposes. Left ethno-nationalism, as I've explained many times, is the way to do it, and you start to understand that by the fact that they want us to identify as right wing, because it's not in our interests, and against the left because that's not in our interest too. The left contains all these social organizing ideas and advocacy ideas and means for compassion and social accountability that will enable us to gain popular adherence and force and boundaries. So it's very important. And Dutton doesn't realize that he's playing a fool's game, and neither does Iron Duke. It's a real shame. And again, I wouldn't bet $5 because I would lose the $5 that you can change someone like Iron Duke. He's going to go on to the end of his life saying that, the left is the problem. Not realizing that he's been tricked to say that. And that this guy that he thinks that is so great, Paul Gottfried, is a part of the trick. And this is what I want Stephen St. James to hear, because Stephen St. James is resistant to this fact as well. Apparently in England, there's a lot more interface with the Goyim purveyors of this liberal betrayal. That doesn't mean that the logics of meaning and action that they're drawing upon, at very least, and not all that indirectly, aren't coming from the kosher folk. Religion being the classic example, whether it's Islam or Christianity, obviously Islam. And there you have it. Just for one example. Okay, let's moving on. Categorical imperative says Christianity has been failing for half a millennium. Good, I hope it keeps failing. And do you think clerical will succeed in persuading rabbis to declare secular Coranism Noahide? Obviously not. Carl Rangel, many of the ancestors set up Freemasonic lodges and Grand Lodges. Most of the Freemasons that will implement the Noahide law will be Christians. Carl Rangel says rabbis will only have a minor role in implementing Noahide laws. Carl Rangel. Why would a system of laws forbidding idolatry and blasphemy be implemented by Christians whose religion is idolatry and blasphemy? Carl Rangel says Christianity isn't idolatry. I say, who cares? Categorical imperative. So Noahide laws come from the Talmud, so it is necessary that rabbis rank the Gentile religions according to their conformity with Noahide. I care what the rabbis say, right? Only to know, maybe to know what kind of shenanigans they're up to. Categorical imperative says, Carl Rangel, idolatry is the worship of anything that isn't God, and God that exists outside of the universe as pure spirit and energy who must not be confused with his creation. Jesus was a man. Not categorical imperative. I say God is patterns, if anything. Categorical imperative. Christianity has now had 3 global empires. Since Christianity is considered the religion of the West, it means most Westerners are corrupt, cowardly, and hypocritical liars. Categorical imperative. If the Western global empire is I don't believe that. This is a debate between a Christian and a non-Christian. Claire just hates white people. Maybe. But she's certainly not doing us any favor. Categorical imperative seems to be okay with Claire, which I'm not. Categorical imperative. Claire Carr believes that she is the only person. Well, who cares what Claire believes? I certainly don't. Nobody is agreeing with her, so what does it matter what she believes? Doesn't matter at all. For many people working on real solutions, Islam is not the real solution. So, well, I agree that Islam is certainly not the solution. As a comment says, but I'm here for Daniel, not the Chinese woman. Oh, good. Made the right choice. As a comment says, I love Heidegger. Heidegger is very good. He's not perfect, though. Don't make that mistake. GW seems to think he is. He's not. Not social enough, for one thing. And also not biological enough. Daniel needs his messages amplified. I think so. I think and these messages do need to be. Daniel is right. Self-preservation. Yes. What else do we have here? House of Commons says to categorical imperative, boom, got you. Now I'm going to guess you are not white, right? And categorical imperative says, are you proposing to expel Muslims only if they are non-white? I foresee difficulties getting through Parliament either way. We're nowhere near a situation to expel people. We are, rather with the DNA Nations, we are working on a program of including people into our group, which would be our people. In other words, not including aliens into our curation of our genus and species to begin with. Okay, so that's it. Let's save some time. I can suggest to anybody to who hasn't caught the earliest part of the show. It's probably the most important part. That's the reading of the Harre article was a bit long and not as productive as I might have hoped. But okay, I mean, it's not that it wasn't productive. It's just that it got into some weeds and some kind of way of talking that could be taken by the, let's say, the non-politically correct police to be, oh, there he is. There's that stuff again. No. You're not understanding. Anyway, there you have it. I think on Tuesday or Wednesday at 7 o'clock Central, that would be 6 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time. I hope to be talking with Per Norden from Sweden and Mirth Baron from England. And I thank you all again for joining me, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.